This is the Economist cover from May 1st, 2021, the most dangerous place on Earth. And here's the Economist cover from May 3rd, 2025, the Taiwan test, it's closer than you think. Apparently, the Economist is on a 4-year cycle, kind of like the Olympics, but instead of gymnastics or figure skating, it's regularly scheduled programming about how Taiwan is a ticking time bomb. The most dangerous place on Earth.
The most dangerous place on Earth.
With this headline, you'd think people would be dodging missiles on their way to grab breakfast. But unlike Ukraine or Gaza, both active conflict zones with high levels of civilian casualties, Taiwan boasts some of the highest personal safety rankings in the world. And on the political front, Taiwan far outranks the United States on the Economist's own global democracy ratings. But stable democracy and crime-free cities don't get subscribers. Chaos does. So, according to The Economist, Taiwan remains the most dangerous place on Earth.
The most dangerous place on Earth.
With that danger closer than you think. As you might be able to tell, I've become increasingly frustrated with the gap between how Taiwan is talked about in the global media and what life in Taiwan is actually like. Today we'll talk about where this gap comes from and why it matters more than you might think. Hi friends, I'm Sarah Plavnik, a researcher who has spent 8 years studying Taiwan's media and culture, and this is Taiwan Salad, a space where I answer all of the questions about Taiwan that you were too afraid to ask, such as, is Taiwan really the most dangerous place on Earth? All right, let's get started. Part 1, the next war trope. Once you start looking, this next war trope is everywhere. There's The Economist selling chaos, but there's also the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, all with attention-grabbing headlines suggesting that the Taiwan War will be the next war. Here's one glaring example. On March 27th, 2025, the New York Times morning newsletter landed in my inbox. The newsletter was about a leaked Signal chat discussing Trump officials' plans to attack the Houthis. It's been a long year, guys. And then, in the middle of this newsletter, almost as an aside, Taiwan was dropped in. Here's what it said. Imagine a different scenario. The next one, in which the subject is not bombing Houthis, but deploying American ships and planes to protect Taiwan. If China knew about US plans, it could preempt, outflank, or outsmart the Americans. It could jeopardize American lives. It could seize Taiwan before the United States has time to act. So there's a lot of crazy things in those two sentences, not least of which there's the expressed concern for American lives with no regard for Taiwanese lives. But to stay focused, let's take a look at the phrase, the next one. Taiwan has long been considered the next war. Before Gaza, before Ukraine, arguably since 1949, Taiwan has always been considered the next one. And yet, there's still no war. The issue here is how casually Taiwan gets used as a shorthand for future conflict. It's the default example. And this kind of coverage becomes a feedback loop. Taiwan gets associated with war, and then the media reinforces it, and soon that's all anyone ever hears about Taiwan. Check this out. When I do a Google News search for Taiwan, I have to scroll down for almost an entire page before I start to get results that aren't about conflict with China. And not quite sure what's going on with this poor girl. Based on these headlines, it's as if Taiwan only exists in relation to China, and only exists as a place that will be invaded. It doesn't exist on its own terms. This next war trope is so widespread that it's hard not to believe. Even I've fallen victim to it. Actually, that's an interesting story. It was back in 2022, and I was living in Taiwan doing research for my PhD. That October, the LA Times published an article with the headline, "If China declares war, these ham radio enthusiasts could be crucial." The article suggested that conflict with China could lead to disruptions in cell phone and internet service in Taiwan, at which point shortwave radio could become an essential form of communication. So I visited the radio club, expecting to see people stockpiling emergency communication supplies and running tactical drills. Instead, I found myself at a small campground on a river on the outskirts of Taipei, where a group of middle-aged and retired men were setting up antennas. It was just a regular Tuesday. No one was thinking about war, and no one mentioned anything about China. They did, however, try to convince me to apply for a ham radio license, and they taught me the basics of Morse code. Overall, I had a great time at the radio club, but it was hard to see the connection between this group of hobbyists and the LA Times Next War headline. Some of the members had received training in emergency communication for natural disasters, and yes, possibly for man-made ones too. But China wasn't front and center, and the club even had a rule: no talking about religion, business, or politics. Despite what the headlines would have you believe, this wasn't a militia group prepping for conflict. It was a group of hobbyists gathering weekly to hang out and turn knobs. So that was my experience with the Chinese Taipei Amateur Radio League. The reason they go by the name Chinese Taipei is a story for another time. But to make things more interesting, I'm not the only one who had this experience. This is Clarissa Wei, a Taiwanese-American journalist. Maybe you know her from her excellent cookbook on traditional Taiwanese recipes. By the way, this danbing recipe is excellent. I make it for breakfast all the time. In an analysis for foreign policy, Clarissa recounts that she once brought a foreign cameraman and producer to this very same amateur radio meetup, notably just a month before the LA Times article came out. The producer had told her that this group was preparing for war with China, but when they got to the radio club, they quickly realized this was not the case, and they left the park disappointed without the footage that they needed for their video. Clarissa's experience with foreign journalists was not an isolated incident. Foreign journalists often arrive in Taiwan looking for war footage, realize there's not a war, and then leave disappointed. And the degree of interest in Taiwan from foreign journalists is also closely linked to current events. For example, in August 2022, then U.S. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, which was a big deal because American politicians of this stature typically do not visit Taiwan. According to one fixer that Clarissa interviewed for her article, Pelosi's visit created a media frenzy because of how much it irritated Beijing, and sparked a growing interest in stories related to Taiwan, but only if they fit into the story of an angry Beijing and an island under threat. So I was actually in Taiwan when Pelosi came to visit, and the international headlines were so intense that I had friends and family calling me to ask if I was okay, as if a war had already broken out. In the meantime, people in Taiwan were going to work and going to school, eating in restaurants, and continuing life as normal, with no immediate threats to their safety. Similarly, leading up to the Taiwanese 2024 presidential elections, journalists flocked to Taiwan for footage to match the idea of Taiwan as a flashpoint for potential war. However, what these journalists found was, to quote Clarissa, "The guns are airsoft guns and air raid shelters are just parking lots. Life in Taiwan is shockingly normal, yet normalcy doesn't lead to good television." Right, normalcy doesn't lead to good television, and it doesn't sell subscriptions. But you know what does? Chaos. Part 2. Should I bother visiting Taiwan if it's about to be a war zone? This question is all over the place on social media. In the Facebook group Taiwan Travel Tips, someone is planning a trip to Taiwan to celebrate her father's birthday, and she wants to know if she should be concerned because of recent reports. Someone else says that she's planning a trip to Taiwan with her 2 teenagers and wants to know if she should be concerned. And then someone on Reddit reports that her friend's mom told them not to go to Taiwan because she's worried that a war might break out while she's there. The responses to these posts are pretty consistent. They'll say, "You have nothing to worry about. Please proceed with your trip." Or there's the response that's like, "You have more to worry about gaining weight from the delicious food than you do of a war breaking out." And then there's this frustrated person on Reddit who says, "This is the 3,000th time that this question has been asked. Taiwan is ranked 4th in the global safety rankings, and yet people are still worried that it's not safe. And then it's up to these individuals on social media to ensure them that it is safe. But individuals on social media can only do so much when they're up against the full force of the global media." The next war trope paints an inaccurate picture of Taiwan, and this inaccurate picture has serious consequences. When people continuously hear about the risks of war in Taiwan, they start to believe that Taiwan is dangerous, and as a result, Taiwan's tourism industry and international reputation suffer. The stakes here are higher than they may seem. This is because these types of headlines don't just shape what tourists think, they can also shape trends in policy making. Even people in government and think tanks aren't immune to the headlines, and trends in the media can quickly become trends in policy making as well. So a few months ago, I was talking to someone who works in Taiwan policy, and he said, "It seems like everyone at happy hour these days needs to have an opinion on whether China's invasion of Taiwan will be a land invasion or an amphibious invasion. When the standard narrative about Taiwan is that conflict is coming, preparing for Taiwan-China conflict becomes a trendy topic, which then encourages more funding and resources directed to it, and even gives more career capital to the people working on it. And it's not just casual talk at happy hours. This framing shows up in major policy publications as well. Recent articles in Foreign Affairs written by experts from institutions such as CSIS, the German Marshall Fund, and Brookings have headlines such as, "The looming crisis in the Taiwan Strait," and "The risk of war in the Taiwan Strait is high and getting higher." Some of these articles are actually advocating for de-escalation and prevention measures, with subtitles such as How Washington Can Lower the Tension Between Taipei and Beijing. But that nuance is most often paywalled behind alarmist headlines. Now, don't get me wrong, there are real risks of the PRC attacking Taiwan, and it's essential to be prepared. However, if all of the attention is focused on when and not if a war will break out, then all of the efforts are going toward preparing rather than preventing a war, even if prevention remains what is best for all sides. Best for all sides, except the media, that is, because peace doesn't sell subscriptions. Chaos does. Part 3. When your home is framed as the next front line.
I think there's a drastic difference between how Taiwan is reported in American news and how Taiwanese people really feel about their lives in general. Because past summer, I invited an American colleague to Taiwan, and if you remember, that was the time when our new president was inaugurated, and the People's Republic of China sent a bunch of troops and basically battleships to conduct military exercises around the island, right? So a lot of friends of my American friend are very concerned about his safety, and everybody was really in this panic mode. But people in Taiwan basically were just still doing their daily routines as if this is nothing new.
So far, I've discussed the next war trope in terms of what it means for foreigners' attitudes toward Taiwan. But this sensationalized media coverage also impacts people in Taiwan. The thing is, people in Taiwan have lived with the threat of war for decades. But recently, people in Taiwan have seemed a little bit more worried. A recent report by the disinformation think tank Doublethink Lab found that among Taiwanese teens on TikTok, there's a growing sense of defeatism about cross-strait tensions. Most of these teens still oppose unification and support the status quo, but there's a growing sense that Taiwan does not have the power to resist a Chinese invasion. The Doublethink Lab links these attitudes toward a lack of communication between the Taiwanese government and these teenagers, but it's also likely influenced by all of these international headlines that they're repeatedly exposed to saying that Taiwan will be the next war. In mid-June, Taiwanese social media was full of posts about the importance of buying emergency preparation kits. The trend seems to be at least in part set off by a Facebook post from the Kaohsiung branch of the American Institute of Taiwan, in which their cowboy water buffalo mascot named Amigu posted about the importance of having a go bag. The post got 17,000 likes, and for context, posts on this page typically only get a couple hundred. With constant headlines painting Taiwan as the next war, it's easy to understand why people are worried. But at the same time, people in Taiwan have decades of experience living with threats to their government, sovereignty, and lifestyle. In fact, the experience of going about your daily life and thriving, even while your very existence and everything you know is under threat, is a central part of what it means to live in Taiwan. I'll let my friend Professor Changming Yu explain in detail.
I think there's this weird sense of seeing how normal people are, and you think that they are not thinking about the possibility of having a war. I don't think that's the case. I think the case is really how we have basically done this a few times before, and it is always a constant threat from the other side, right? So we have been living this with a long time. So I think part of this resistance is to do your thing while consider that possibility in the background, right?
The next war trope has been around for a long time, so much so that it has been absorbed into people's lifestyles and attitudes. But it has also been pushed to the background. It's there, but it doesn't define people's existence. So Taiwanese people maintain the agency to live and thrive, even while the threat of war is continuously present. And this is a subtle, yet powerful form of resistance. So then when the foreign media continuously digs up this next war trope from the background of Taiwanese subconscious and places it front and center, it almost feels like an act of violence because it violates the rights of Taiwanese people to narrate their own lives, tell their own stories, and to represent themselves. What I'm trying to say here is that representation is important. This is a central tenet of classic works such as Edward Said's Orientalism, which argues that Western representations of the East are typically projections of Western anxieties or superiority. When the Western media only portrays Taiwan through exaggerated claims about how war is coming, it essentializes Taiwan into a one-dimensional potential battleground. It externalizes fears and anxieties about World War III, and it erases and disregards the experiences and perspectives of the multidimensional people in society that exist in Taiwan. This kind of media coverage also erases the subtle form of resistance that people in Taiwan have long practiced, the ability to keep living normally despite constant threats to their existence. When headlines selling chaos are constantly pushed front and center, it becomes harder for people to tune them out. The fear becomes louder, harder to ignore, and starts to chip away at people's sense of stability and their plans for the future. Part 4. Don't buy into the chaos. So, what to do about all of this? Most of us aren't heading major media corporations or in charge of newsrooms, but there's still things we can do to try to shift the narrative and support better, more balanced reporting. Here are my suggestions. First of all, don't click on clickbait. By clickbait, I mean those exaggerated headlines posted by major international media corporations that are selling things like chaos. Economist, I'm talking to you. Clickbait means chaos, and we don't want chaos, especially when it negatively impacts the lives of millions of people. Okay, so instead of clickbait, we can try to support independent journalism. And some of the best reporting on Taiwan comes from people who live there or have personal connections. So on Substack, some of the pages I've been loving recently include A Broad and Ample Road for in-depth cultural stories, Yunhai Taiwan stories for Taiwanese food, Clarissa Wei's blog Dear Clarissa, and Tech Taiwan for Taiwanese semiconductors. There's also New Bloom, which has in-depth coverage of local Taiwanese politics from an activist perspective. And then for more traditional media in English coming out of Taiwan, there's Taiwan Panorama, which has great cultural coverage. And then for news coverage, there's Taipei Times, there's CNA's Focus Taiwan, there's Commonwealth Magazine, and there's Taiwan Plus. Another suggestion is that you could also consider following specific journalists who work for large publications but that are based in Taiwan. So for the New York Times, there's Amy Zhang Qian, and I specifically remember that during the 2024 presidential elections in Taiwan, she had an article co-published with Chris Buckley about Taiwan's election rallies. And it was a really refreshing take when so many of the other headlines about the elections were just these next war headlines. This was more of a cultural take. And I'm sure there's many other publications and journalists out there that I'm missing and aren't on this list. So if you have more and you have suggestions, please send them my way. I would love to add them to the list. Finally, arguably the best way to gain a more in-depth and nuanced perspective about Taiwan is to go to Taiwan and see for yourself. And if you go, please let me know. Is Taiwan really the most dangerous place on earth? Or is the real risk gaining weight from eating too much mango shaved ice and boba? Cheers. All right, that's all for today. If you have a minute, please remember to like this video, subscribe for more, and comment to let me know your thoughts about media coverage in Taiwan. Have you seen any next war headlines lately? And as always, what else would you like to know about Taiwan? Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye-bye.